Hello everyone, I welcome you to this biology class once again, and in this class I'm going to be discussing evolution with you. When we talk about evolution simply refers to as the cumulative changes in the characteristics of population or organisms over many generations. Evolution implies the different changes that occur in different organisms, okay, from the earliest to the most modern organism, okay. And when we talk about evolution, it could be organic evolution or it could be chemical evolution. Chemical evolution actually entails the chemical component of those organisms, while the organic evolution simply means the sum total of the adaptive changes or feature that takes place over a long period of time in the history of an organism. So this process usually leads to development of new species from pre-existing ones. That means all the organisms that we have today, they come from pre-existing organisms. So in the proposals of evolution also tells us that evolution of life actually started from marine water. From marine water, then it moves to fresh water, from fresh water to land, from land to air. And that is the progression or the progressive changes that takes place in evolution, okay? Apart from that, we are taking the four limbs of organisms generally as an example of evolutionary path of an organism. So if we are taking the four limbs of an organism, we say that the four limbs of aquatic animals are modified for swimming, okay? So because they are water or aquatic organism, they are modified for swimming and orientation in water. On the other hand, the four limbs in the course of progression, the four limbs will change and modify into crawling and hopping, in amphibians, okay? So, and then in the course of evolutionary changes and development, such crawling, okay, and hopping in amphibians will also be modified to running in reptiles. And then as time goes on, it becomes the four limbs is modified for flight in birds, okay, and then for climbing in what? In monkeys, and eventually for walking and grasping and walking, or walking and grasping in human and chimpanzee, okay. So this actually shows that the four limbs that we have in the aquatic animals where life starts is still the same four limbs that we have in humans, where you have the consummation of life, where you have the highest developmental evolutionary trend. So in this case, you can say that life actually started in water, and then it continues to land, and then to air, and all that. So now let's look at the theories of evolution. We have so many scientists that contributed to the theories of evolution. So we're just going to look at the theory of two of them that are most notable, and that's talking about Jane Lamarck and Charles Darwin. Okay, so the first one we are looking at is Jane Lamarck. Jane Lamarck was a French biologist, and he lived between 1744 and 1829. Okay, so basically he supported the fact that evolution actually occur, and it actually started from the marine habitat. But he was of the opinion that this evolution that we're talking about actually takes place as a result of the remains of fossils that you have. Remains of fossils. When we talk about fossils, I will expatiate more on fossils as we move on. Okay, so he supported that evolution actually starts from fossils that you have in the marine habitat. Okay, but his proposition was based on two different ideas. Number one, that the use and this that number one is the use and disuse of organs, and number two, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. When we talk about the use and disuse of organs, Jane Lamarck proposed that organisms that that make use of a particular body part over a long period of time, that particular part of the organism will develop more. Okay, and the other parts of the body that are not in use will remain redundant or will have less development. Okay, so he believed that species do change over time, and that is through the use and disuse of body parts. Okay, and now he now added that after the use and disuse of body parts, those parts that are used can then be acquired or transmitted to the next generation. So, two ideas. Number one, the use and disuse of body parts. For example, if you are right-handed, it wasn't as if you were born like that. You have been using your right hand from when you were young, and that's why your right hand has so much developed and you can now write without thinking. Some that are left-handed, not as if they were born to use left hand, but because that's what they've used from very young age, then now they may find it difficult to use their right hand to write. The left hand are so much developed. That's the proposition of Jane Lamarck, that the body part that you use becomes well developed, and of course, because it is now well developed, it's going to be more perfect in doing whatever you use that particular part to do. And now give a specific example in the case of giraffe. So Lamarck cited example of giraffe and said their ancestors had short neck, but because they kept stretching their necks to reach leaves in high trees during the period of food scarcity. Okay, so he then posited that this voluntary constant stretching of their neck will slightly bring about changes over a long period of time, and eventually their neck becomes long. So according to Jane Lamarck, he said the long neck of giraffe were not there in the earliest giraffe, but because of the continuous use of the neck, continuous stretching of the neck eventually became very, very long, so that they can now reach for fruit or for whatever they want on the tree. Okay, so even though Lamarck was correct by saying the parts of the body that you use become more developed and the one that you don't use becomes redundant, it is not actually proven that those particular traits that were acquired as a result of maybe searching for food or overuse of a particular body part can be transmitted to the next generation. So that is the idea of Jane Lamarck, which is his own theory of evolution. Okay, as you can see in the picture, he told us that in the earliest giraffe, they have short neck, but as they begin to stretch their neck, eventually the neck became long and became what we have today. That is talking about use and disuse of body part, that the part that you use become well developed and the one that you do not use remains redundant. Okay, now let's move on to talk about Charles Darwin theory of evolution. In Charles Darwin theory of evolution, that was about 50 years after Jane Lamarck's proposition. Okay, Charles Darwin is also a British naturalist that brought about some kind of revolution. He wrote a book, and that book brought a revolution in the knowledge of evolution. So his own side was that he recognized that when you talk about natural selection, it simply means that in the case of evolution, natural selection is what brings about the changes that we see, the changes that we observe, the changes that takes place in a particular organism. Okay, so now its own theory could be summarized as follows. Number one, species have the ability to produce large number of offspring, and when they produce a large number of offspring, those offspring will need resources. Okay, but the resources in the environment or the resources of the natural world is limited. Because the resource is limited, competition will set in. As a result of competition, the organism will then develop some variability, okay, which will help them to compete in the natural world. So as these organisms compete, and as the organisms develop some varieties that make them to compete, those varieties are then inherited by the what? By the offspring. So in the competition, the organisms that survive and produce offspring are those organisms that have inherited most beneficial traits for surviving in that particular habitat. Okay, so as the process continues through many generations, the population will gradually become better and adapted to the environment. So that is Charles Darwin's idea of natural selection. That means only the organisms that are able to only the organisms that are able to adapt, that are able to compete, that are able to survive, will now pass on their traits or their future to the next generation, and those are the organisms that we have today. Look at what you have on the screen. For example, in this particular phase, you have certain type of mice, and then two different type of mice. You have those that are dark and you have those that are tan, okay, in a particular island. So in that particular island, you have a bird that will feed on what? That could feed on those mice. But if you look at the color of the mice, one of the color is adapted to the background of the environment, which make it difficult to be seen by the predator bird. Okay, so eventually, as time goes on in that habitat, you see that the number of the tan will reduce, the number of the tan mice will reduce, and then as time goes on, the dark mice will reproduce, giving rise to next generation, and only those mice that have developed the what? Develop a kind of feature that will help them to adapt to the environment. They are the one that becomes that survive. And you can see, even though at the start of this you have this almost equal number. In fact, you have more tan mice than the dark one, but at the end, what do you have? Just two tan, and then you have the rest being flooded by those dark mice, because they have a kind of background that is exactly like the environment, so that they can now be protected from the predator. That's a kind of adaptation, or we can call it either a camouflage or adaptive coloration. Okay, so that is the idea of Charles Darwin, that through natural selection, some organisms survive, while others that cannot adapt, they will not survive. Let's look at evidence of evolution. We have several evidence to show that evolution has taken place, but actually, evolution is an extremely slow process, and because it's an extremely slow process, it's difficult to observe. It occurs for a long period of time. We're talking about thousands of years or millions of years, as the case may be. So it's a process that is difficult to do what? To observe. So as a result of that, the proposal of evolution has come out with certain evidence with which we can show that evolution actually occur. And the first of them is a fossil record. Evidence from fossil record. What are fossils? Fossils are remains of organisms that are preserved mainly in sedimentary rocks. You know, you have different type of rocks. You have sedimentary rock, igneous rock, and so on and so forth. Sedimentary rocks are formed by remains of organisms that have died several years ago, at times hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago. So it is believed that the history of life on Earth is recorded in these fossils. Okay, so the age of this particular rock, type of rock, sedimentary rock, in which fossils are found can be determined by using an instrument that we call radioisotope or carbon dating. So the history of a particular evolutionary change can then be traced through a series of fossils. When you have those instruments, you make use of them to measure the age of the rock, of the sedimentary rock. Okay, so when you measure the age of different sedimentary rock, you can then determine their age. Okay, you can then determine how many years ago those animals that form such sedimentary rock have existed and died. Okay, for example, what you see on your screen, you see a different evolutionary stages of the horse, from the earliest horse, which lived between 55 to 35 million years ago. These are millions of years. And you see the first one, the second one between 35 to 25 million years ago. The first one, you call it hydrocarium. The second one, you call it mesohippus. And the third one, which lived between 35 to 5 million years, merishippus. And then the one that lived between 5 to 1 million years, you call that one Platypus, while the last one, which is the present age, also is called Icus. Okay, so the evidence is that each of these that have this type of horse that have lived or existed in time past, they are this from the same ancestral kind of parent. Okay, so when the type of rocks were measured, were the age of those rocks were traced, they could determine, they could be able to find out how many years ago those type of rocks have existed. Okay, so apart from that, you also have evidence from embryology. Embryology simply means the study of embryo. Okay, so in this case, scientists compare the embryo of different type of organisms that are related. Okay, in this case, you have a fish, you have amphibian, you have reptile, you have bird, and you have mammals. Looking at the first stage in the development of the embryo of these different animals, you can see that the first stage is almost like exactly the same. Okay, you could actually not be able to differentiate between one or the other, and that is an evidence of evolution, that all of them evolved from a particular certain kind of organism or certain kind of animal, and that's why they all have the same type of embryo. So that's evidence from embryology. It shows they all descend from a common ancestors, and that they may still have developmental stages that are very familiar. The next one is comparative anatomy. When you talk about comparative anatomy, anatomy is the study of body structure, internal organs or tissues, and so on and so forth. So here you have the heart of a fish, amphibian, reptile, bird, and mammals. Looking at the heart of fish, a fish, like we said, life starts in water, and that means the earliest organisms, they come from the water. So here you have fish. What you are looking at is a fish with one auricle and one ventricle, a single chamber of a heart. But in the case of amphibian, you have two auricle and then a partially divided ventricle. You can see the evolution from just one auricle and one ventricle here to two auricle and partially divided ventricle, and then eventually to reptiles having two auricle and two ventricle, then to bird and then to mammal with also fully developed ventricle, two ventricle and two auricle. That means they have um, four chambers of the heart. Okay, so from where you have two chambers, just one auricle and one ventricle, to where you have four chambers, two auricle and two ventricle. That is showing a kind of development or evolution from the simplest or earliest organism to the what? The most developed or advanced organism. This is also another example of evidence from comparative anatomy. Look at all these organisms that you have here. They all maintain their pentadactyl limb from the earliest even onto the most developed. Okay, so how about evidence from vestigial organ? This is a vestigial organ, that's appendix in man, and this appendix in man. Okay, in the first place, what is a vestigial organ? Vestigial organ are they are the remaining parts of previous functioning organ in earliest organism. In this case of appendix, the appendix in man is vestigial. It does not really have a function per se, but in the case of herbivores, the appendix function as a cecum. Okay, but in man it doesn't have any real particular function. Apart from that, the muscles in the ear of a man is also vestigial organ, because a man does not need to use the muscle to twist the ear, unlike what you have in ox. In a us, the us will have to twist their own ears to the back or the other way around in order to detect or catch sound. So in man, the muscles in the ear, they are vestigial organ, while in us they still function. You can see that's evidence from vestigial organ. Now you also have evidence from biochemistry and genetics. Biochemistry is the study of cell at molecular level. When you talk about molecular level, those molecules that form um, um, uh, the protein that bring about different genetics, different genes in an organism. For example, you have the sequence of amino acid in the same part of hemoglobin in these different organisms. Okay, so it is believed that all organisms use the same genetic code to synthesize protein. Okay, so this particular protein hemoglobin in human have this sequence of amino acid. In us, this sequence; in gorilla this, chimpanzee this, and then in zebra this. But what do you observe? They all have a kind of pattern that is similar, and that is amino acid histidine. Okay, they still have some similar amino acid, but not at the same location. But you can see that histidine is all at the same location. So biochemists, they have compared the amino acid sequence of proteins found in different organisms, and they have found that organisms that are closely related, they often have protein with what? Similar amino acid. So that is evidence from biochemistry and genetics. Let's talk about forces responsible for evolution. What are the forces that are responsible for evolution? Very important, because we have already agreed that evolution takes place. Okay, but what are the forces that bring about evolution? What actually induce evolution, or what actually trigger evolution? Number one of such is genetic drift. When we talk about genetic drift, a genetic drift is actually changes in allele frequency. Changes in allele frequency of a gene pool that is due to chance or random event. So that particular change in frequency of existing gene variant in the population that is due to random events is what you refer to as genetic drift. So genetic drift may cause gene variant to disappear completely and thereby reduce genetic variation. Okay, let me use this example here. Okay, you have at this particular stage the parent population, and then after some time you see that some of the population, they move to a different location, and as they move to a different location, you see that you still have a particular species or a particular gene that is dominating in that particular new location. But as time goes on, if that particular gene that is dominating begins to reduce, okay, that's after a couple of generations, and eventually you have entirely new type of organisms, and that is uh, one of the forces that bring about evolution. So genetic drift is believed to be more widespread in small population where you have chance or random events that can wipe out the carriers of the allele completely. So the carrier of this red allele in this case have been wiped out completely, giving rise or leaving only this of purple in place. So that's a genetic drift. When you have allele changing frequently changing in a pool due to chance or random events. You also have mutation. Mutation is simply change in the DNA sequence of an organism, and this can result in errors in DNA replication during a cell division, or it could be exposure to mutagens or viral infection. You have different type of mutation. You have the if it's at the DNA level, because mutation could be at DNA level or protein level, or it could even be at the chromosomal level. So if at the DNA level, you have the one you call substitution. That means the DNA is being substituted. Like I said earlier, it could be as a result of cell division, replication, error in replication of in cell division, or it could be exposure to mutagens, okay, or it could be viral infection. So it could be deletion, that's complete removal of that particular DNA, as you can see here, or it could be an insertion, a new kind of DNA being inserted, or it could be an inversion. That is also a change in the configuration of the particular gene. Then let's move on to another one, which is a gene flow. When we talk about gene flow simply means the transfer of genetic material from one population to another population. When genetic material moves or is being transferred from one generation to another, one particular generation to another generation, that is gene flow. From one population to another population, that is gene flow. So the gene flow actually can take place between two populations of the same species through migration. When the particular species migrates from one particular population to another population, then we can say gene flow has occurred. And that also happens over a long period of time, and eventually brings about changes in the what? Bring about changes in organisms. You can see from this picture, you have the western deer, you then also have the eastern deer population. The two different type of population, look at what is dominant here, the color dominant here. Eventually, when they move past the mountain range, you have a different type of population of deer in the eastern population. That is a very good example of gene flow. The gene has moved from this particular part, has moved from a particular region to another kind of region, and of course, as they move, the gene also change, and that is a gene flow. This is another example. You can see the deer live in a warm climate. The deers you have here, they're in a warm climate. And some have thicker fur than the others. Now, during movement or migration, some deer become separated from the rest of the group. Okay, so These are the ones that have separated, and in the cold mountain climate, the deer that has thick fur are more likely to survive for obvious reason. But those ones that don't have thick fur, they eventually die. Okay, and then as years pass, each generation has a greater population of the deer with what? With thick fur. And after many generations, most of the deer in this particular cold mountain will have what? Thick fur. That is another a, a kind of that's another type of, what's it called now? The force that bring about evolution, that is responsible for evolution. Okay, so those are the major points you need to know about evolution, and I hope you have learned something in this class. Please don't forget to share, don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to like this video. Thank you, and I will see you